In this lecture, we're going to return to the origins of agriculture and talk about other places in the world, other than the Mideast, where they have their own experience with agriculture starting. We'll see here in China that it's based more on rice than in the Middle East, which is more wheats, etc., barley's, grains. And then we'll go to the New World where it's based a lot on maize and corn and teosint and different plants. And as we discussed in the last class, there's certain animals that can be domesticated, and there are certain plants that can be domesticated. Not all of them. And like the animals, we want plants that sort of live in groups, so we can have a lot of plants and produce a lot of food. Uh, and we'll see this happen, as I said, in a few different parts of the world. And we can see here that there are age ranges that of the slaughter of animals that differ over time, and people can study those to see if these kill off or slaughter moments at certain ages represent whether they want the animal for its skin or for its meat or what have you. And these, are very important for telling us about the diet of these societies. Now we can move over to China. Oh, I'm sorry. This is still Jericho. I'm sorry. We're still in the Middle East here. And it's I don't I might have mentioned this in the last class, but Jericho. Well, we all know of the biblical Jericho, but Jericho ends up being much older than the biblical period, which is sort of the end of the Bronze Age into the early Iron Age. It's actually one of the earliest Neolithic sites there is, earliest farming sites there is, and it's what it's even called the Aceramic Neolithic, where there's a phase of it there, which means they weren't even producing pottery, which is traditionally associated with the origins of agriculture, but they do it quite early here. And we can see that they get these, we can see on the upper right that they have these large towers that date all the way back to the Neolithic. So you probably know about the walls of Jericho. Well, these walls are very, very old. So apparently Jericho is quite famous for these walls. And we can see that there are also these heads, as I believe I mentioned in the last class, of statues that were found there. So Jericho is a really important site. It in Çatalhöyük, um, Halan Chemi as well. I mentioned some of the sites in the Near East, um, but let's move to another part of the world. Uh, we can see here for the New World, for example, the domestication of corn. Um, as I said, or maize and turn it into corn. I should say once again that rice was one of the bases for that in the Far East, but in the Americas, maize or corn were very important. And what we see here on the left and the right is fascinating, and that is those on the real small ones on the left are progenitors of corn, and it was a very small plant. But when we domesticated it, uh, we chose for ones with bigger kernels and bigger cobs. Uh, just like with meat, we would choose for beefier animals or cattle that produce more milk, or sheep, sheep that produce more wool, etc. Now, maize or corn is this is a new world um, plant, uh, and it was domesticated in the New World uh, by the Native Americans here in this in Central and South America. Uh, so this is a third place where we see agriculture taking off on its own, and we see what effect it has on the plants of making these quite large plants, and in many ways sort of unnaturally large. And we can see here the shape of the plant itself even changes. This is a teosint plant. And once you can see what it was like on the left of the teosint, um, uh, and the little cobs and the grains, and then as it was manipulated, um, we can see that the cobs are much larger, and indeed the plant itself changes. So these are one of the things about domestication is important to keep in mind is that domestication is a humanly induced uh, uh, selection of the species. It's not a natural selection. It's we control where these plants, which plants or animals will be altered in order to produce more food. Back to the old world, I just want to show you this really old map here based on carbon 14 dates that shows the spread out of the Near East on the bottom right, where it's sort of Syria and northern Iran or Iraq and Iran and southeastern Turkey, where this is one of the our first place where domestication takes off, and as I said, first of three. And we can see the dates, the carbon 14 dates of the earliest Neolithic sites, that is to say, ones with domesticated animals and plants. And we can actually date how it spreads out from the region. And notice that it's not too fast, uh, but it's always to the detriment of the hunter gatherers. And then I mentioned in the last class, unfortunately, there's a very good chance that in your lifetime, the last hunter gathering tribes will disappear. And this is terrible because this is the way we all survived throughout our evolution. And if you look on a grand time scale, since we've only domesticated animals and plants in sort of a second or a minute in the last day. If the human evolution was a day, we've only sort of domesticated animals in the last minute. But this is spread like wildfire, and it's thought too that it wasn't just spread by the idea, but it was actually the people who would move into these areas and introduce this new type of subsistence. Hunter gatherers are not quick to do this. First of all, it's a lot more work. Uh, it's just a completely different way of life. You're no longer nomadic. You're sedentary. You're building architecture, and as I said, pottery starts being produced, and it changes our whole way of life. But it spreads, and as I said, we think it's what's called a demic diffusion, of the diffusion of the people themselves into Europe. And indeed, they've studied the alleles of, the DNA of modern Homo sapiens, and the Europeans do have a strong link with the Middle East, and so we believe that they completely displaced those hunter-gatherers and eventually brought about their downfall, unfortunately. And that seems to happen wherever farming is introduced, North America and elsewhere. It's it narrows the amount of food that we eat, but it produces more of it. And it's sort of a risk minimization strategy that, unlike a hunter gatherer, you're going to have food and you can store it, etc. But this requires you live in one place, you're not nomadic, and a complete change in your lifestyle. And we can see these dates here of when farming started in the Near East and how it spread. Those dates are, for the most part, have held up throughout history. Some places are a little bit older. But in any case, we can see how it spreads into Europe. And that is that, the Europeans live off this Middle Eastern sort of diet that started 9,000 years ago. And we still see effects of it till this very day. Although due to transportation, et cetera, we do eat a lot of, rice-based or obviously maize-based foods because things can be shipped around a lot, but not back then. Now, here's something that's interesting too, and I want to move up to to England, where the end of the spread of agriculture in the European peninsula, uh, it sort of ends there. Uh, but we get a very interesting building near the end of the Neolithic, and that is the very famous Stonehenge. I should point out that their henges, there's a lot of henges in northwestern France and southern England, but this one is made of stone and it's the best one preserved, so it's the most uh, uh, famous of them. It's also near the end of the Neolithic, and this is important because of the following. In the Neolithic societies, we become sedentary, we've domesticated animals and plants, but we still are living primarily, and we live in villages. We're no longer nomadic bands, but those villages are primarily egalitarian. Now, that's not to say that every human being's equal, and indeed within the family there's inequality, parents versus children, etc. Um, but what it does mean is that nobody in these societies are born into kingship or born to be a chief. If you get that status as being, somebody in charge of the rest of them, you had to earn it. Usually during warfare or something to that effect. And we will get into what are called stratified societies that will begin in the Bronze Age, and we live in now, which is there are different classes of people. People on top, people in the middle, people in the bottom. We'll get back to that when we get to the Bronze Age. But this is still sort of the end of the Neolithic. But the important thing about the Stonehenge is that it is a structure that requires communal work. So somebody had to be in charge here, telling them what to do. It almost certainly required an architect. The stones were brought from far distances, like 60 miles away, dragged in, stood, up. How they were dragged in is still a question of debate. But they're stood up and then lintel blocks over the top with these gaps in the middle. And so this, required a lot of people and some sort of direction. And keep in mind that when you're building these things, you're not working in the field. You're not producing food. So it better be damn important, if you're going to take up a lot of people's time to build a public or communal building. And this is one of our earliest public buildings. But calendars are very important for farmers. Very, very important. Maybe some of you have lived on a farm. I don't know, but in any case, you have to, sow the seeds at the right time. If you're off a month or something, you can really kill your crop, and so you have to know time pretty well in order to survive, especially in these northern climates where there's winters and you can't grow all year around. Here we see a plan of it. There's an outer circle to Stonehenge, and but then the stones are on that inner circle. I should add, by the way, if you ever have a chance to go to England, and I hope you all do, you should take a visit to Stonehenge. It's really, really impressive. And we can see that there's a burrow far around it, and then there are different stones set up in different spots that would help, you know, um, whoever could read this calendar would stand in a certain position, and we suppose wait for the stone or the sun to rise over a stone or in between two of them in order to tell them what time of the year it was. And once again, to reinforce this idea, it is this, you stand on one side and you would wait for the sun to come up in the middle of one of these. And indeed, I believe it's for the vernal equinox that this works perfectly. So the idea that it's an ancient calendar seems pretty certain. And it's also quite interesting that we get calendars so early on. We already saw one in the Paleolithic on a piece of bone, and then here we get these large stone public structures. And once again, these have been studied, and the sun does indeed come up in between certain rocks that align with those outer rocks that tell you what time of the year it is. We can keep in mind that it's not exactly precise now because there's a wobbling of the axis of the Earth, which I believe I discussed a little bit when we talk about the ice ages. And this changes precisely where the sun comes up and goes down. And so this will change, but slowly, and so it might not have even affected when this henge was in use. But once again, this isn't the only one. They're all over the place, but they're primarily made of wood. So not many of those ones have preserved. This stone one, of course, has. It should be added too that these were stones. It wasn't originally this large, but stones were added over time. And here's another shot of it to give you with a human in it to give you an idea of just how big these stones are and what pretty amazing technical skills they had to stand these up, and to get a lintel block on top is pretty impressive. And we see structures like this when there's incipient hierarchies emerging. That is to say, we're getting more stratified. We're getting into much more different class systems that, like we'll see in the Bronze Age. But Stonehenge is a Neolithic structure. I should add, by the way, that the Neolithic in different areas is not of the same dates. It just means the phase in which farming begins, but metallurgy has not begun yet. And so it's different places, it is at different times. We see this wonderful drawing here of these structures with all the henges built. For the longest time, it was thought that Druids used these. That's not the case. Druids emerged much later than these structures. But Stonehenge has been a focus of fascination for a long time. And here's just a fun little cartoon, that gets on the idea that this is far more. This is a lot of work. Is it worth it? Now they call it a computer here, but as I said, it's more of a calendar. But how they got those huge lintel blocks, and I should point out in this cartoon, the humans are way oversized. They were much smaller than this. So they probably had some sort of pulley systems, etc., to lift these stones up. Now back to food. We see how it can change over time as it gets domesticated, as a plant gets domesticated. And what we basically see is that the fruit of the plant, be it seeds or what have you, get larger. Because of course we're going to select for plants that produce a lot more food, and we're not going to let grow or replant the seeds of a plant that doesn't produce much fruit. So these will change, and they change only because of human manipulation. So once again, this is an idea of what domesticated plants are. And also, just like the animals I mentioned, I believe on Friday, these plants rely on us for survival. Because a lot of these plants are not even natural to their environments any longer, and if they are, they're still they are a far larger number than was naturally the case. When we can see here that we will choose, for example, plants on the left, like Caranopodium here, and to produce more fruit. One of the reasons, as the caption says, that dense is not good for wild plants is because the seeds, are spread via the wind, and so you want the branches and leaves to be sort of sparse. But if you're eating them, you don't. And so we see this change in the structure of the plant. And indeed, we see here with some New World plants or New World plant that when we domesticate, we select for larger plants, and those come from larger seeds. And here are some. Here's a couple of New World sites, uh, like Keats Cave. So just as evidence that it had happened in the Americas, although later than elsewhere. But it wasn't introduced here. It was developed on its own. And indeed, in the Andes, we have the Guitarrero Cave, where really fascinating work is being done on early agriculturalists. Uh, and so once again, the Middle East wasn't the only place. It happened in different places, and it was based on different foods that were naturally there. This site has some nice stratigraphy. I like to show you this just to, give you an idea of what it's like to excavate how, in a systematic way. Nice square there, and you slowly scrape off the top. The areas around this square have already been excavated. And they found some interesting fibers at this site, which is quite interesting because it means that these plants were grown not just for their food, but for things like making baskets, etc., and then textiles. Indeed, plant textiles, or plants can be used as textiles. It's not always animal hair, and that's what is happening here. And so we get evidence for that. And you can make baskets, etc., clothing if you wished, all that sort of stuff. Now, back to the Far East. In the Southeast Asia, once again, there was a lot of sites for early domestication. And we see one site here called Phnom D. And I pointed out to you just because it has a burial, and there's cemeteries, and that's one of the things that starts now because when we were hunter gatherer, we were moving around a lot. They either buried some people where they died or just just left the body. We don't have many burials from prior to farming. But we start getting cemeteries in the Neolithic. One, people were sedentary, so they have an area outside the town or the village where people get buried. So that's new. And as we'll see, they eventually become markers for heritage of a place, and that cemeteries will be used to show that people have been there for a long time. And with the grave goods, it also suggests that there was a belief in the afterlife. As we see here with this princess barrel, there's a lot of grave goods. Well, what does she need them for? Well, if you believe in the afterlife that you need, that it's a living thing, you really need it. I will see this in Egypt too. This is a concept that the afterlife is a corporeal thing, right? It had objects. You were physically there. It's not like we tend to believe in Christianity, where it's just our spirits, right? They thought you could take it with you, as the saying goes. We all, if you've been unfortunate enough to have to go to burials, etc., you might have heard the expression, "You can't take it with you." The thing is that no matter how much you earn or material objects you collect, it doesn't make a difference when you die. But people still get buried with objects. Do they need them for the afterlife? Perhaps. Perhaps they're just symbolic. But we see the emergence of cemeteries with farming. So it's another really important thing with the Neolithic. We not only get villages of the living, we now get villages of the dead. And I should have probably shown you this slide before, but this is another cave where they have good evidence for the evolution of these of early maize at Tehuacan here, and so more evidence of the American origins of agricultural phenomenon. Now, one thing I want to point out, which is really important to us, is that we've already seen stone tools in the sense of napped or flaked stone tools, as we see here on the left. And those will continue on. They continue on to this very day, as a matter of fact, even though metallurgy replaced the need for a lot of them. Now these are chipstone tools that made from things like flint or obsidian that have good cutting edges. But what gets introduced during the Neolithic are ground stone tools, and these are tools for grinding food. And so there's a processing of food because you can't you want to grind the wheat, etc. To make bread or what have you. But also another interesting thing is that they're quite heavy. And so they're another indication of sedentism. That is to say, you're no longer nomadic, and you make things and you have things that you cannot move. And so we start to find that these type of tools in the Neolithic. I think I talked about the groundstone axes in the last lecture, and here these are groundstone mortars and pestles, basically, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, for grinding food. And this is a very much a early farming tool, and continues on to this day. And finally, here I just want to show you how much domesticated animals and plants have replaced the wild plants, etc. And and they really sort of take over what we consume. It's we tend to think that we have a variety of food, and we have a bit more these days because we have supermarkets that can ship in food from different areas. But basically, if we're just relying on domesticated animals and plants, there's just a handful of plants and animals that we have domesticated and we regularly eat. So really narrowed our diet, as a matter of fact. And one of the interesting things too is that we've focused on plants that produce a lot of carbs. And you need them if you're a nomad, certainly, because you're walking around all the time. You need them as a farmer because it's hard physical labor. But when you're sedentary, like most of us are, you don't. And all they do is add a lot of weight. We tend not to use up all the carbs in us, which are good for energy, but they have to be used. And and since we're no longer nomads, and that's when we evolved with the need for carbs because we were nomadic. Now that we're no longer nomads and we produce a lot of such foods, we gain weight, quite frankly, and but you can see the dramatic difference in the type of foods as farming emerges. And so we will let off there and then turn to the Bronze Age in upcoming lectures.